I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again from Toronto, Canada. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the Trump impeachment hearings and, in fact, revelations now that have come out about Stephen Miller as well, who is Trump's advisor. He has white nationalist leanings, seemingly, in leaked emails that have now come out. Is that really much of a surprise, considering those of us who have been following Stephen Miller and his career so far? He's quite a quiet man, an introvert, what many would argue, but nevertheless, his opinions have been disturbing for a while now. So these revelations, as spoken of now, are sort of just proof on what we've all known, aren't they? Or are they not? Maybe this isn't as big a deal as we're all making it out to be at the end of the day. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our panelists. We're joined now by Jim Williams, who's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's Washington Bureau Chief for LJC Media and Genesis Communications. He's joining us now from Washington. And we're also joined by Sascha Auerbach, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from London. Sascha and Jim, thank you both for your time today. Jim, I'd like to start with you. Stephen Miller, not really a person who's known for very balanced views, even from day one, really, since he came into his position. Are these emails a surprise in any way, do you think?
Not to me. I mean, if you look at the history of Stephen Miller, I mean, he was at Duke University when Richard Spencer, who has been, whether he is or isn't, but he's at least been given the moniker, if you will, of the founder of the alt-right. It was Stephen Miller and his work with Richard Spencer that began to take his leanings toward this white nationalism to a very serious level. Now, he then began working with, of course, Steve Bannon. Bannon, at that point, was the man in charge of Breitbart. Breitbart has always been heavy into promoting what is going on with the alt-right. So, frankly, to me, anything having to do with Stephen Miller and anything, promoting a white supremacist agenda has not been a revelation. I mean, it's really something that is part of the DNA of Stephen Miller since he's been prior to the White House, when he was working with Jeff Sessions in Congress, and now as he's an advisor to the President of the United States.
Indeed. And, Sascha, this is not a new relation. Certainly, Ilhan Omar had already labeled, Stephen Miller a white nationalist a while back, and she'd been attacked for it at the time by Donald Trump himself, and even Donald Trump Jr., amongst others. This sort of is just proof of what we've all just known all along, isn't it?
The evidence was certainly there of his tendency towards white nationalism. But I think it's important that we understand that folks like Stephen Miller, they don't identify themselves self-consciously as white supremacists and white nationalists. White nationalism has become one of those concepts where there's a fairly large, broad spectrum of people that fit on it. And I thought it was interesting and brought up Richard Spencer. I think Richard Spencer is a much more controversial figure and much less, how can I put this, intellectual in his approach to the issues. I think when you look at Stephen Miller's writings and look at what he said, he has actually a fairly coherent policy stance on things like immigration and what makes America culturally what it is. Richard Spencer is much more reactionary and much farther to the right. And I think in many ways that makes Miller the much scarier figure because he's able to portray his views as relatively reasonable, relatively rational, as ideas that can be translated into policy without on the surface seeming as extreme as they actually are.
So, Jim, all of this essentially, from what I've understood, goes back to the debate over immigration, doesn't it? With the leaked emails speaking in detail about immigration and Stephen Miller's views on that specifically. Do you think now that in some way the White House or the U.S. as a whole will revisit some of the immigration policies of the Trump administration, or do you think that's just now engraved in stone?
Well, no, I think they're going to have to go back. I mean, immigration is going to be a major political issue coming up in the 2020 election. If you recall, and I think this is important to remember, there was a handshake deal early back in 2016 2017 between Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, and President Trump to basically give him $25 million for his border wall if he would then work with them on passing the Dreamers deal. Trump agreed to it, and by the time Schumer got back to Capitol Hill, which is about a 20-minute drive from the White House over, the deal had seemingly been blown up because Miller went crazy and said, along with some of the other advisors, but Miller, was the main one, saying, no, we can't do this. So suddenly he not only went to an extreme position on the Dreamers, he also blew an opportunity to get every penny he wanted for his border wall.
Interesting, Sascha. What do you make of the immigration aspect of all of this? Of course, because that is seemingly Stephen Miller's passion.
Yes, well, I think from the very beginning, he's shown a profoundly anti-immigrant stance. And, again, judging by his writings and his policy briefs, he has tried to portray it as not being a racialized stance, has been about the economic situation in America, about the idea of a sort of cultural coherence to America, the concept of border security. So it's always couched in what seems like these very, very rational terms, I think in part to avoid the label of being called a white nationalist. But I think that certainly is what he is. He's just done a good job of, in certain circumstances, camouflaging it from that appearance.
So then the basic question then becomes, as many people have called for, Stephen Miller's resignation. Is this a good time for him to be resigning? Because I imagine it would be disturbing for a White House advisor to have the kinds of views that he has. I mean, not to say that the president probably has any better views.
I think Stephen Miller, if you look at it, is probably in the safe zone. I think that Trump feels very comfortable with him, that he feels that he speaks directly to his base, and like it, don't like it, whatever. Trump is, he's been very loyal to Trump. Trump loves loyalty, and I have no indication from anyone I've ever spoken to that Miller is in any trouble at all of being asked to resign or being forced to resign. His power with President Trump and his ability to have his ear seems to be as strong as it ever has been.
But then from perspective as just an American citizen yourself, Jim, I mean, I imagine this is disturbing to have a White House advisor sort of just, prompt and push the president even further to the right, possibly on certain issues.
As a citizen, he scares the living hell out of me. Yes, absolutely. But as a journalist, I'm just giving you the facts as I see them on the ground.
Yeah, no, I understand.
No, I mean, it's percent. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this guy is a freak. But there's a number of interesting characters that have found their way into the Trump White House, and yes, I mean, there's absolutely no question that Stephen Miller is so out of step with the mainstream that it's ridiculous. But and that he is racist in many different ways. I mean, his immigration stances on pretty much everything has been wrong, and if you look at it, most of them have been stopped by the courts. So, but that doesn't mean through these executive orders and other things that he has not had a tremendous impact on policy, which can be done by fiat by the president as opposed to just by legislation.
Sascha, what are your thoughts on that? Because, this sort of ideology that Stephen Miller espouses, and even Donald Trump, it can be argued at some level, they have their support within the U.S., obviously. I mean, that's why the president was elected and still is in power in the way he is with as many supporters. What do you make of that? I mean, that in and of itself is disturbing, isn't it? That there's actually support for this sort of thing out there.
Well, I think when you look at the history of American politics across the 20th century, there's been a pattern of nativism, right? You could look back to the early 20th century, and the politics of places like New York and Boston were extremely nativist, except it was against a different immigrant group. It was actually against the Irish. So this has been a red meat issue, a hot button issue that unprincipled politicians can use to their advantage. I think another dynamic to keep in mind here is that, Trump, I don't think Trump really has a coherent ideology. He's not a very intelligent man to begin with, and he's extremely impressionable. And it makes him very vulnerable to people who do have a coherent ideology that they can articulate in a convincing fashion, and one that merges with Trump's populist approach, right? Because Trump is all about the adoration of the crowd, about energizing his base. And then somewhere in there has to be policies and there have to be actual ideas associated with it. So he looks to someone like Miller to give him those ideas, to do the really heavy, detailed policy work that he has absolutely no interest or capacity to do intellectually or emotionally.
And so I wonder, I've certainly heard the argument that Sascha's made before as well, where Donald Trump goes where he believes he'll be more popular. But I mean, I imagine at some level, Jim, that he'd be a lot more popular, if he were to not be sort of espousing this sort of ideology, and not to have sort of advisors that he has. I mean, he's had headaches from day one, hasn't he? Even just as candidate, because of his views. Hasn't he brought all of this onto himself? And what does that then say about him?
If you look at it, I mean, he didn't really have the backing of the Republican Party and mainstream Republican Party until, well into his presidency. I mean, when he first came into the office, Ronnie Previs, who was his chief of staff, was the head of the Republican National Committee and was trying desperately to draft people into the administration who, might have a more moderate tone. But if you look at the vice presidential pick, Mike Pence, I mean, he was as far right as you could possibly be. Jeff Sessions, who was his original AG, was again far right. So most of the people that he was able to, who kind of glommed onto President Trump and supported President Trump from the beginning when he was candidate Trump, had extreme views. And they were not in step with the Republican Party. And so when he, became president, there wasn't a lot of people that came rushing to want to be part of, his staff, because frankly, they had been aligned with many of the people that he had denigrated during the campaign. So, you get what you pay for, as the old saying goes. Right. And that's where he got it.
Sascha, if I bring you in, because I wonder at some level if you think that Trump just wants to be surrounded by yes men. I mean, because at the same time, though, we say that, yes, he's impressionable and can easily come under the influence of those around him. I mean, I also think about all those people who he's fired over this time that he's been in office. I mean, I imagine at some level he just wants people to just say yes, sir, to whatever he says.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's not someone who wants any type of debate around him. He's not someone who respects disagreement. He's not someone who's interested in exploring different possibilities on issues. He wants adoration. He wants agreement. He absolutely surrounds himself with sycophants. And if you look at the history of the advisors that he's gone through and discarded, they're all, without exception, they're people that did one of two things: either embarrassed him somehow or simply disagreed with him and tried to advocate a more rational policy. And yes, absolutely, he wants to surround himself with yes men and people who are insecure, who aren't particularly intelligent. They often do that when they end up in positions of power. They have to rely on people that are smarter and more capable than they are, but at the same time, they resent and kind of fear those people. So the moment there's disagreement, they dismiss them.
We'll leave there as our final comment, but of course we appreciate both Sascha and Jim for their time today, and of course for their insight and for the context they've provided, because this entire issue of Stephen Miller from day one has been one of disturbing ideology, certainly. And as Jim had pointed out, Stephen Miller's background is quite well known now, as far as his previous activities as well, when he was significantly younger as well, in his college days, etc. He's always espoused these sorts of views. So he came into his position with Donald Trump knowing what his views were. He was pretty much hired probably for those views, to sort of just egg on Donald Trump in a sense. So a white nationalist as White House advisor, not a surprise really, because again, Donald Trump himself it can be argued as white nationalist himself too. So this is sort of just the blind leading the blind, isn't it? And what does that then say about the direction that the U.S. is taking as a whole? The fact that, as I put to our guests, this president and Stephen Miller have their support within the country. Their views have support, significant support within the country, be it over immigration or otherwise. That is certainly disturbing, just the thought of it. We'll leave it there for now for this edition, for this segment, pardon me, I should say. I'll be back, though, after a break with my final segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the program, we're going to discuss Brexit and a statement that the European official, I should say European Council President, that is, the outgoing European Council President Donald Tusk has made regarding Brexit, essentially coming out and saying that Britain should not stop trying to stop Brexit altogether. Now, for the European Council President to say this on any day would probably be scandalous, but especially during now an election campaign in Britain over the very issue really of Brexit, because that's what this election has been termed in that country, Brexit election. One would really question how smart this was of this official to be making this statement, even though, yes, he is outgoing. And as he said himself during his statement, that he would be fired for this if he said this earlier on in his career or his tenure in this current position that he sits in. Let's discuss that a bit further and the impact of what this may be going forward on the elections and otherwise. We're joined now by David Jeffery, who is lecturer of UK politics at the University of Liverpool. He's joining us now from Liverpool itself. Joining us from Queensland in Australia is Frank Moles, who is senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland. And joining us from Sussex in the UK is Paul Bromley, who is a UK political analyst and university lecturer. Paul, Frank, and David, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Paul, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of Donald Tusk's statement? I mean, this is sort of indicative also about the sort of dysfunctionality of the EU as well.
I think it's largely the timing that's caught most people by surprise. Obviously, Donald Tusk is about to relinquish his post as President of the European Council. And I think he himself said that the responsibilities that he's about to give up and giving up those responsibilities allowed him that freedom, perhaps, to say some things that he wouldn't have said otherwise. And it certainly caused a bit of a stir in the United Kingdom because we are in the middle of this election, which has been called about Brexit, although there are other issues as well. So it's really provided a bit of a boost to the Liberal Democrat Party because many of them are standing and have put on their ballot papers now that we have had the nominations that they're standing for the Liberal Democrat Party Stop Brexit. So he's given a real boost to the Liberal Democrats, but certainly from the Conservatives and the Labour side, they feel as though he shouldn't be interfering in another country's elections. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, doesn't agree that Britain would ever be a second-rate player. And David Davis, who used to be a senior Conservative in the cabinet, also says that he thinks that Donald Tusk, rather like Obama or Trump, should stay out of other countries' internal affairs.
Indeed. Dave, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Who do you think this strengthens? I mean, I imagine at some level this actually strengthens those who are pro-Brexit, doesn't it? Because it sort of proves that the EU doesn't even respect, a democratic referendum, for example, that took place within the United Kingdom.
Yeah, that's certainly one argument that people in favour of Brexit will make. But I think ultimately Donald Tusk, an EU establishment figure coming out against Brexit, will be a surprise to nobody and will change nobody's minds. It's a complete non-event in this election, really. Most people will either go, yes, we agree with what Tusk is saying, or roll their eyes and say, typical EU. Ultimately, it won't shift the dial in any meaningful way.
Frank, what are your thoughts on this? Because, again, I imagine this sort of goes against all diplomatic rules, really, or just norms when it comes to relations between the EU and the UK, especially at such a sensitive time.
Yeah, I would agree with what both speakers have said before me entirely. It's, of course, tempting to engage in these kinds of, call it election meddling if you want, on the way out, and if you suddenly have that freedom, but they hardly are helpful. They're typically counterproductive. On the one hand, yes, the Lib Dems in the United Kingdom will actually welcome it and see it as a vindication of their perspective, but as much as it does that, it will at the same time also fuel these kinds of things that the previous speaker have pointed to, the idea of, oh, here we go, you see the European Union is vindictive, or it's not, it's an imposition, how does it dare to meddle in our affairs? So I think upon reflection, I would hope that Donald Tusk will agree that this is not a very smart move. It helps nobody. I think it's sort of stooping to another level, if you could put it that way. I think the wisest position would be to keep professional, diplomatic, and perhaps even go the other way around and say, listen, it's a democratic right of any member state to lift Article 50, to want to leave the European Union. We are a democratic club, and if this is the wish of one member state to leave, then it has every right to do so. Whether the process was due respecting due diligence, I'm not so sure, and most people are not so sure, but that's a different matter altogether. And I think that would have been a more diplomatic, professional answer that would be accurate and also respectful, and perhaps also not be counterproductive.
So Paul, if we move beyond the fact that obviously this was not smart for the European Council president to be making this sort of statement, considering his position, but if we're just looking at what he said, was he correct, do you think?
I think the issue of Britain and the empire is one that has hung over the Brexit referendum going back to 2016, because for many people, this idea of taking back control was also about turning back the clock to a different time. And the issue has now resurfaced, although you could very strongly argue, and many people do, that you cannot go back to the days when Britain had an empire, ruled 1/5 of the world, and Britannia ruled the waves. That's what many people feel sentimentally on the pro-Brexit side of the argument. What Donald Tusk is saying, that if Britain does leave the European Union, he feels that they will be isolated and the world has changed dramatically beyond that. So this issue of empire still runs deep within British society. It still forms part of the argument, even though it's well over 50 years now since the former US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, spoke about Great Britain having lost an empire but not yet found a role. Many people in Britain are still struggling with that concept of where the United Kingdom is in this new interdependent, more global society. And what he has done is raised again both the sentimental as well as the sort of theoretical and academic arguments about Britain's role in the world.
All right. So, David, what are your thoughts about that? Did he make a fair point about the British Empire, the past British Empire, I should say, and then, of course, about what Britain's role will be in this globalized world going forward?
I think it's very tempting often to make these broad historical narratives to try and fit in contemporary events. But I think ultimately, many people voted to leave because of issues around immigration, issues around sovereignty, and an idea that Britain can strike its own way in the world. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they want Britain to go back to ruling other countries. Those days have long gone. But this idea that Britain has separate interests to 27 other EU countries, and that the sum of the interests of the EU are not necessarily always in the UK's favour. I think it's very tempting. It's quite easy for foreign leaders to say you just want to turn back the clock and bring back the empire. But I think if you look at who's often making arguments about influence in the world and the ability to control or shape global events, it's actually those on the Remain side who say if we leave the EU now, we leave a position of strength where we have power over this organisation. Yes, we have to share some power, but we are in a position of influence within the EU. If we walk away from that, we're walking away from that. Many on the Brexiteer side are quite happy to live as a kind of, the cliche of pulling up the drawbridges, but this idea of a country going its own way, not having to part of these multilateral organisations to the same extent they would be. So I think it's a bit of an unfair argument to make from Tusk.
What do you make of it, Frank? Because I imagine at some level it's sort of ironic, isn't it, for to be saying this, considering the argument, at least on the pro-Brexit side, has always been that the EU regulations and EU controls too much. And, it's sort of, I guess at some level can be argued to be almost acting like an empire itself.
Yeah, of course, in Britain, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what the European Union is, how it's organized. I've taught European politics in Britain myself for many years, and it was just very hard to do because the students come in with a very preconceived idea about the European Union, very strong beliefs about the European Union, typically negative, on the back of very little inside knowledge into the institutional workings. And that was always the first challenge, to really get people to engage with what is the European Union like, and talk about supranational elements, but also intergovernmental elements, and to try and explain that the European Union is a hybrid entity that can't be classified as uniquely supranational. So that was an uphill battle for many years for anyone teaching European politics in a British university. I often jokingly said it's easier to teach Marxism in the US than it is to teach European politics in Britain almost. But that speaks to issues of how informed the electorate was to begin with. And I think the British electorate has learned more about the European Union the last 3 years than it did in the previous 3 decades. Right? And that's a tragedy in some sense, that it's actually leaving an entity that it's only now discovering, despite all the rhetoric and the complexities of what drove the Brexit vote. There's lots of stories to be told there as well. Often it was immediately assumed that this was a kind of a working class revolt, low income earners in the Midlands and so forth. And actually research doesn't really confirm that. It confirms that the support for Brexit was far more widespread and particularly pronounced in the middle classes. So there's a lot of stories to be told about support for Brexit as well. But I think the more interesting story is Britain's perception it has maintained over long periods of time, supported by a lot of misinformation and low-quality media that has actually peddled misunderstanding for many years. So hence, it's been an uphill battle for people studying and teaching European politics in the United Kingdom.
Paul, sitting obviously outside the UK and looking at this from the outside in, and I've done a number of shows now, quite a few number of shows actually on Brexit, it does boggle the mind that this one vote, this one referendum has almost brought the UK establishment down to its knees, where it's just having a very hard time moving forward, backwards, sideways. There's an argument at every corner. There's bickering at every corner. Do you think that at some level then Tusk is correct that, listen, this is actually hurting the UK and will hurt the UK possibly going forward too?
Certainly the latest economic figures suggest that there is an element of stagnation, and Britain hasn't yet quite recovered or moved on from the Brexit vote. Is anecdotally also many people are saying they're holding back on spending decisions or personal decisions until the Brexit is sorted out, which is why Boris Johnson was so keen to meet that 31st of October deadline, which of course he failed to do. He then says this election is the one that's really going to sort it out with a new extended deadline. Certainly Donald Tusk has been a great friend to journalists down the years, even if he hasn't been a great friend to all the various politicians, because his pronouncements have always made news. And perhaps in a way, it's been refreshing to have a European politician who speaks very openly and does speak his mind on some of the issues that are affecting both Britain and the rest of the European Union.
He's not the first one, is he, David? Because, I remember Juncker a while back had made quite an offhanded statement as well about Brexit and about his annoyance with the entire process. We've had Michel Barnier also coming out sometimes and just being very politically incorrect at times as well. So, going back then to the EU itself, this sort of then proves the point that maybe EU, leadership doesn't also completely know how to handle the situation very professionally.
No, well, of course, the EU has its own interests. The EU has a desire to show unity in this negotiation, and specifically, with regard to Ireland and Ireland's position with the border with Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Obviously, this is almost a once-in-a-lifetime event for the EU. It never expected anybody to trigger Article 50. The UK has, and the UK's not been an ideal negotiating partner, right? 'Cause, it was a very close referendum result. Theresa May set out in the early days of her premiership a series of red lines that really did cut off a lot of avenues for fruitful negotiation. Then the loss of her majority meant that even if she could come to an agreement with the EU, she couldn't come to an agreement with her own party. So yes, the EU probably has no idea or is approaching this as a unique event, but they've not had the easiest partners in the UK to deal with.
Frank, as somebody then who has taught European politics then in the UK yourself, how do you view that point? Because it's interesting, isn't it, that the UK has had such a hard time just deciding or agreeing upon basic factors when it comes to Brexit, even right in the wake of the referendum when it took place.
Yeah, it goes back to the point of, and I think the previous speaker made a good point that the European Union also grapples with this whole story as much as the UK does, but it's not so visible because the UK seems more in distress about the situation than the EU, and that's partly just perceptions because it's not unimaginable to see how this could easily have been a situation where the European Union was stumbling over its own feet to deal with the situation, but that situation hasn't arisen precisely because the problems in Britain are overshadowing the ones in Brussels. So what happens now is that you end up in a situation where Brussels can say, well, come back when you have a solution and we'll talk further. They can actually look far stronger than they perhaps are. But it again goes back to the point of going into this process with very shaky knowledge about not just the European Union, but also about international trade is just a very odd premise. And to realize that things, the officials in Brussels will tell you that a Norway Plus deal could have been negotiated in the time span of 6 to 9 months. People are all in agreement about that was a feasible proposition. Had that been the starting point, presumably that still could be arranged if there was a unanimous support for that position in the United Kingdom. But you hear Boris Johnson still coming with Canada Plus and solutions about the Irish border that we know that have been proven fallacies, and they're still being wheeled out as if they're going to unlock the situation. So that tells you something about the learning process. As I said, a lot of citizens seem to have learned a lot more about the European Union in the last 3 years than the last 3 decades. But it seems to me that the leadership in the United Kingdom is still grappling with a lot of this stuff and seemingly unable to really engage and say, well, let's really look at what the European Union is. Let's come clean with ourselves and the positions, and then talk in real sense what this is about. And the Irish backstop is a classic example of this. The belief that this could be arranged through what was called the Malthouse solution with electronic digital technology was just fanciful. Yet people keep wheeling it out, and I'm sure it will be reappearing if we have the elections done and dusted. It'll come back again, even though people will tell you this is just not an adequate solution.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate all three of our guests for their time and insight today. Frank was speaking to us there from Queensland in Australia, David from Liverpool in the UK, and Paul from Sussex in the UK as well. Now, viewers, this issue of Donald Tusk speaking his mind really comes as he is walking away from his position as European Council president. So he probably has, or felt at least at some level, that he had the freedom to be able to speak his mind, though it was certainly not diplomatic language to be using, talking about British Empire and trying to, again, play up the sensitivities of the British people in that regard, as Paul had mentioned as well. But then there's also just this proof, almost, in my mind at least, that the EU also is just as dysfunctional when it comes to this Brexit issue as the UK establishment has been ever since that referendum took place. It's just been chaos on both sides, hasn't it? And there have been statements on both sides which have not been helpful to the process of actually having the UK leave the EU after having been part of it for so many years. We'll certainly keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.